I will start just with a land acknowledgement. No, start it because we're today doing it about Yiddish writers. We're going to do the land acknowledgement af Mamaloshen. Der Peretz Center für jiddische weltliche Kultur befindet sich auf der traditionellen, oversticker und nicht abgegebener Territorie von die Musqueam, Zweibetuth und Squamish Völker. Das Land ist gewesen ein Ort von Lernen für die eingeborenen Völker, wo man hat übergegeben seine Kultur, Geschichte und Traditions von dort zu dort bemächtigt Jahrtausende. Wir erkennen an die Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh und Squamish Völker und seinen Mäude zu sein und willen sich der Mannen in der wichtigen Rolle, was die eingeborenen Sprachen haben gespielt beim Aushalt von dem Land. Lassen wir streben, durch unsere Praktik und Lehrerei zu schaffen, der erzdicke und dekolonisierte Beziehungen zwischen unseren Sprachen, Kulturen und Traditions. And in English, the Peretz Center is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. The land we are situated on has always been a place for learning for the indigenous peoples of this land, who for millennia have passed on in their culture, history, and tradition the knowledge of how to take care of this land from generation to the next. We acknowledge and thank the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples, and remind ourselves of the important role indigenous languages have played in sustaining this land. Let us aspire through our practice and teaching and cultural work here at the Peretz and beyond to create new, respectful, and decolonized relationships between our languages, cultures, and traditions. And on that note, I'm very, very, very excited to have our guest speaker today, Faith Jones, who will talk about the amazing and under-recognized work of Shira Gorshman. And this is our final lecture in the Zhargon lecture series. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Zhargon is course that we teach here at Peretz with Jess Goldman and myself, which kind of integrates in-person sessions learning about the histories, culture, and language of Yiddishkeit with online lectures from experts, scholars, artists, and translators from around the Yiddish world. And we're very, very, very honored to have our own local Yiddish scholar, translator, and activist, Faith Jones, and I'll introduce Faith Jones right now. Faith Jones is a librarian, translator, and researcher in Yiddish culture in Vancouver. She is a member of the Digital Yiddish Theatre Project, which brings primary source material and accessible inquiry to the public sphere. Her book of translation of Shira Gorshman's stories, Meant to Be and Other Stories, was recently released by White Goat Press. She is the co-translator of the Acrobat, a selection of poetry by Celia Dropkin, and she created supertitles for the National Yiddish Folksbiene new production of Kadya Molodowsky's genre-defying folkloristic play Alle Fenster zu der Sonne, All Windows Face the Sun. Faith Jones' research on Yiddish language activism in Winnipeg and Vancouver has been published in scholarly journals. Her recent essay, How to Suppress Yiddish Women's Writing, which was published in Ingeveb, responds to the current state of scholarly denial of the rich, complex history of women's literary culture in general and in Yiddish in particular. And I'm so, so honored to have you, Faith, here to continue and support the amazing work that you've been doing and to sort of undo the kind of suppression and marginalization of such an important part of the corpus of Yiddish literature. So we're super, super happy to have you here, and I'll just hand it over to you. Thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. And I'm just really pleased to be here and to be talking to you about this writer with whom I am obsessed, Shira Gorshman. Is everybody hearing me okay? Yep, okay. Okay. So I want to, so I called tonight's talk Recovering Gorshman, Yiddish Feminism and Utopian Visions. And you will see why very shortly. and it is not. Why is it not going forward? There we are. So today's agenda, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Gorshman's life, her beliefs, her books. I'm going to talk about reclaiming Gorshman and how this came to be my work. And also there'll be time for questions and discussion at the end. And I want you to feel free to ask questions as we go along, especially as we are such a small group. It's nicer to have the questions, I think, at the time that they occur to you. So I might not see you lift your hands. So if you do want to speak, maybe Itmar or Jess, maybe one of you can just verbally tell me that there's somebody wanting to talk.
For sure.
Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about Gorshman's life. She grew up she was born in Krok, Lithuania, which is a really small town. And I don't even think she grew up specifically in the town. I think they were just kind of near the town. So she really grew up in a dorf. Her childhood was very, very poor. Oh, I should say her name at birth was Shira Gorshman. She grew up very, very poor. Her father became a Polish. So let's do a real quick Jewish culture check in here. Who knows what a Polish is? A Polish. This is the weirdest thing. A Polish is kind of like a Jewish monk. So there was this way that Jewish men could sort of absent themselves from sort of daily life and become purely religious figures. And so they, would just wander from town to town. They would live in the best medrash. They would rely on charity, and they would study holy books, and that would be their work. The problem is that there is a biblical injunction to be fruitful and multiply. So a certain number of men who wanted to do this, what they would do is they would get married, they would have one child. As soon as that child was born, they would abandon the family and they would become a Poresh. So so that is what happened with her father. He became a Poresh. She never knew him. And unfortunately, her mother remarried a very abusive stepfather who was physically abusive, and her grandparents, her mother's parents, ended up raising her. They didn't want her to grow up with such an abusive household. So, so she was raised by her grandparents. Her grandfather was quite adamant that she should be educated, which she was. And when he died, the family unfortunately could no longer afford it. So her education did stop when she was 14, when her grandfather died. However, she did also work on the family had like a homestead. They had some cows, they had some geese. Her grandmother did fabric dyeing. So she worked in all those things as a child and as a young teen. But in 1920, when her grandfather died, she moved to Kovno, Kaunas in Lithuania, and she became involved in labor activity. And she became involved with a fellow who was also in the same sort of labor circles that she was in. And they did not get married, but she had her first daughter with him when she was about 15 or 16. And so they were, working together in these political circles in Kovno when they decided to move to Palestine. 1923 or 24, not entirely clear exactly when, but she joined a group called Gedud HaAvodah, which is kind of famous. You can look it up. It's kind of famous in in sort of the history of Zionism. It's called Gedud HaAvodah, means labor battalion. It was a radical proletarian group. They owned no individual property, for example. They did heavy labor for the emerging Jewish settlement in Palestine. They did road building, they cleared rocks, they drained swamps, and so on. They lived in tents, and they moved to where the work was. So they were, unlike a kibbutz, they were not based on doing something, on the land, like growing something, but they were instead a labor force, a movable labor force. As will surprise absolutely nobody who is ever been involved in left-wing politics, there was a schism in Gedud, and Gorshman ended up deciding to move with the more left-wing faction to pick up and move to Crimea. The more centrist faction stayed in Palestine. And her partner stayed in Palestine. So she split with her partner, and she moved to Crimea with her at that point, they had 3 daughters. The left-wing group was under the direction of Mendel Elkind. And I just want to say, just to be clear, this is not the writer Mendel Elkin. It's a different person, Mendel Elkind, with a D at the end. And many people had quite a lot of criticisms of Elkind. He was considered egotistical. And many people thought that the schism in Gedud was entirely fallout from his personal feud with Ben-Gurion. So the feeling was that if they had put aside their, personal vying for supremacy, then they could have actually, the rift within Gedud would never have happened. And as it happened, the remaining group of Gedudniks who stayed in Palestine eventually were unwillingly absorbed into a kibbutz. They lost their independence, and the crisis of the crisis of these political actions, of the split and then eventually the winding down of Gedud, really produced a crisis of faith, as it were, in both Zionism and the left for both the remaining members and the previous members. And Gorshman, even though she had left, she was aware of the crisis that was facing Gedud, and she kept in touch with it as best she could from a distance. And it was very shocking and very upsetting to, people who had obviously given their lives to this, to this, idealistic vision of a left-wing worker-focused Palestine, is Jewish Palestine. So
ask a question.
Of course.
So, I mean, maybe you'll address this now, but like when Shira Gorshman moves with this, more left, I guess, faction of Gedud to Crimea, like, do they still consider themselves Zionists at that point, or what's the relationship to that?
Well, it's complex. I think many of them had lost interest in Zionism. I think some did not see any kind of conflict between Zionism and communism. They felt that those two were two things that they could support equally, and because what they had been working towards was a worker-dominated state. That was what they wanted that was the Zionism that they wanted. They didn't really see it as being entirely in conflict. So I think it's quite complex. I think people were fed up. I think they were fed up with the sort of Jewish bureaucracy in Palestine, and they had been made quite a few promises about going to Crimea, which seemed to them at that time offer more independence. So let me move on to talking about that now, and hopefully it'll become clear. So in Crimea, where they went to was a new collective farm called Voyanova. This was one which was entirely founded by this group who had left Gudud. And so Voyanova, it's an Esperanto name that means new way, but it was a Yiddish-speaking group, and there just was no sense that they could use either a Yiddish or a Hebrew name for their commune, but that was, you know, that was their ethos. They were a Jewish, culturally Jewish group. So they had been promised, when they came, they had been promised the right to use different kinds of centralized services, like for procurement and distribution, for example, while still being independent. Whereas most of the collective farms were under there were two main authorities that ran the collective farms in Crimea, and most of the collective farms were under one or the other of them. But Voyanova was going to be completely independent. This was always a lie. There were constant battles with the local and even the National Soviet agencies about whether, even just sort of what crops they should be growing, things like that. So there was just a lot of there was a lot more dealing with the bureaucracy than what they had anticipated, and this, it probably would have been better for them to actually literally just fall under one of the existing authorities rather than having to navigate all the different parts of the bureaucracy. So after they had been there for less than 2 years, Mendel Elkind was taken away. He was later rehabilitated, apparently. Apparently he was still an asshole. But at any rate, he got taken away. And then just a few months later, I believe, Gorshman met Mendel Gorshman. And Mendel Gorshman was an artist who had come from Moscow on a delegation with other artists to make, art, drawings and paintings and illustrations about the emerging Jewish life in Crimea. And so he ended up spending some time on the commune at Voyanova. And, the idea was to have these images of Jews as productive labor, as opposed to, sort of the image of Jews as sort of urban, individual, small trades people. So Shira Kushnir and Mendel Gorshman got married. They moved to Moscow, and it was there that she began writing. And it does seem as if she had gotten out of Crimea really just in time, because the commune was completely disbanded shortly thereafter. It was the land was given to one commune, and the people were dispersed to several of the nearby communes. And it seems as if they really had an absolutely terrible time of it during the war in Crimea. So it was very lucky that she had gotten out. She was in Moscow, and she and Mendel Gorshman had one son together. During the war, Gorshman herself ended up evacuated to Kyrgyzstan, but before that happened, I think it was her youngest daughter, Elijah, starved herself to death, seemingly in grief over the family members who were still in Lithuania, who they had visited. They had visited the family shortly before the outbreak of the war. And so it seems as if just knowing what was happening to them in Lithuania pushed her over the edge, and she stopped eating. And it does seem as if the parents and grandparents that were left behind in Lithuania did all die, either in their town or in the camps. So Gorshman and her son, who was a young child at that time, they were evacuated to Kyrgyzstan. The two older daughters stayed in Moscow. They were of working age. They stayed in Moscow, and were contributing to the war effort. And Mendel Gorshman was serving in the army. And then the family was reunited back in Moscow at the end of the war. Mendel Gorshman died in 1971, and Shira Gorshman moved to Ashkelon in 1990, and that is where she died in 2001. I just want to point out, when we talk about Gorshman moving to Israel in 1990, she was 84. She was 84 when she pulled up roots and moved to Israel, and then she continued to work on her books. She republished several books. She wrote some new material in those remaining years, which is pretty incredible at that age. And then she died in 2001. So what were Gorshman's ideas about things? So if we look at Gorshman's beliefs, I refer to her as a utopian cynic, which sounds like those are things that are sort of in conflict with each other, but here's how it worked. She was kind of always looking for a utopian path, but she was always disappointed and angry in the way it turned out. And I think her early work in the labor movement just taught her to be wary of anybody with power. Maybe also her experience in her family, being a child who was subject to abuse. Maybe that also made her, just very uncomfortable with any sort of expressions of power. And when she went to Palestine, that was part of a utopian project, but she became quite critical of every, sort of all the different governmental structures that she came into contact with there. Of course, the British, but also Jewish leadership. And then after her return, she was quite critical of the state of Israel. The dissolution of Gedud in Palestine and of Voya Nova in the Soviet Union both confirmed her distrust of political systems. At the same time, one of her deep abiding interests was in the problem of women's liberation, both in terms of within oppressive political structures and also within liberation movements themselves. There never seems to be an answer to the problem of women's liberation. And so the majority of her stories center on women, and sometimes on work that is considered women's work, such as household work, child rearing, or associated trades such as midwives, seamstresses, and so on. But sometimes the women in her stories are doing work that is outside of the traditional roles. So Hannah, in her autobiographical novel, Hannah is in charge of a large herd of sheep and cows, and she supervises the male shepherds and bosses them around with great authority, just as Gorshman herself had done in Crimea. And her stories also include many instances of women being violent, and in many situations, she approves of women's violence. So when I look at her work as a whole, I see that in some ways she anticipates the need for a specific movement for women's liberation, but she does not use any terminology or tell any stories that make me believe that she was involved in feminist organizing in the Soviet Union. And so therefore I call her a proto-feminist. She didn't have a sort of a feminist political organization or a sense of women organizing together as being the solution. I will say after she returned to Israel in 1990, and she was sort of rediscovered by a number of feminist groups. They helped her publish in Hebrew. A feminist group was her first translators into English, and so on. So feminists found her, but she didn't necessarily, I think, have that sense of belonging to a movement of women.
Faith.
Yes, dear.
When you said that in many situations she approves of women's violence, like I'm just curious to know some examples of that. Like, are we talking sort of, you know, like violence as resistance to women's violence as resistance to male violence, or just sort of any violence?
Yeah, sometimes it's women's violence, you know, as resistant to male violence. Sometimes it's just violence again when something's wrong. If something that's being done is wrong,
Right.
then sometimes you react violently. So there's a whole variety of them in her stories. I don't want to do too many spoilers
Okay, yeah.
because I want you to buy the book.
Yeah.
But I will say that it is surprising to me, the many ways in which she sees women's violence as being sort of corrective.
Interesting. Cool.
It's not, it's often about male power, but not always.
Hmm.
So I'm going to move on to talking about her books. So she published 10 books in Yiddish. There were some translations into Russian and into Hebrew in her lifetime. But this is, these are her original works. We could do another little quick review of Jewish history here. Anybody want to guess why her first book was published in 1948 and the second one was not published until 1961? Maybe? Yes,
Stalin?
go ahead.
Because of Stalin?
Because of Stalin. Do you know, Dan, do you know more specifically what I'm talking about?
I mean, they just kind of turned off the switch for Yiddish cultural stuff.
They turned off the switch in November 1948. So this is referred to in Soviet studies as the freeze. And then when they were allowed again under Khrushchev in 1961, that is referred to as the thaw. So that is the freeze and the thaw. So her first book was published in the middle of 1948. So I'm not going to go into a long explanation of why they turned off Yiddish culture and then why they turned it back on. But if anybody needs to know, just remind me or just put up your hand and I'll go into that. So Gorshman arrived in Moscow in 1930, and she was immediately plunged into this cultural milieu, and she became friendly with many Yiddish writers who were in her husband's circle. And this inspired her to start writing. And she had been educated in Yiddish until she was 14, and so she was able to read and write in Yiddish. She spoke Hebrew very well. She spoke and read Russian very well, but I do not believe she wrote well in any language except Yiddish, because that was how her education had been structured. So she wrote in Yiddish. One of the people that she became close to was Leib Kvitko. Anybody want to tell us who Leib Kvitko was? Nope. Okay, so Kvitko was a really, really well-known poet and children's writer. His works were translated into Russian and were read by generations of Soviet school children, and many of them did not even ever know that it was originally written in Yiddish. He was so integrated into sort of the mainstream of Russian language children's publishing in particular. A lot of his poetry in Yiddish was also, his adult poetry was also translated, but it's really his children's works that were sort of the most well-known and the things that sort of propelled him into this sort of very mainstream position in Russian culture, in Soviet culture. And so as a result of this, he was extremely well connected in both Yiddish and Russian publishing. And I just want to read to you Gorshman's own description of Leib Kvitko discovering her writing talent. So I'm just going to read this out to you. I had written a story, Der Mitesser, and I left it on the desk, and I was washing the floor in the kitchen because it was my turn to clean the shared kitchen. Kvitko came to me with the papers and said, "Did you write this?" And I said, "Yes." "Good Lord," he said, "why have you kept silent? Good God, I knew that all mothers give their children the breast so they can eat, but this is the first time I've read a story about a mother who locks her son away because he always wants to eat." The story is published. It's called Der Mitesser. This is a parasite that lives inside you and keeps eating because the child is never sated and is growing up in a very poor family. This story I keep including in my books. That was my first serious story that I wrote, and it was judged to be the kind of story Sholem Aleichem couldn't write. Not that it's better than Sholem Aleichem, but that's what the critics said, that Sholem Aleichem couldn't write it. Leib Kvitko, who was a wonderful writer, well known over the world, he said, "Even if you write nothing else with just this story, you'll be recognized in our literature." So the story in Yiddish is called Der Mitesser, and that means the fellow eater. It is a little person inside you who eats and eats and eats and is never satiated. And she refers to it here as a parasite. This is not an actual parasite. It is an emotional parasite because you never know where your next food is coming from. And so you have to keep eating and eating and eating because you're just so afraid of it being taken away. And like my mother grew up in the Depression, I can tell you she has a hard time stopping eating to this day. She will just eat anything that's on her plate because she still doesn't feel like she's can be secure that food is going to be there the next time. So that is what she's talking about, and that's what she wrote about in the family in this story. It's a very tragic story. You can read it in the book, and the family, has a response to it, which ends up being very tragic. So that is the story of Kvitko discovering her talent, and he arranged for the publication of that story in a Soviet journal, and then throughout the 1930s, she continued to publish, and she was very well regarded, and had generally a positive response to her work. Of course, this writing is then interrupted by the war and her evacuation. And so then after the war, she collected her stories for the book, and that's what came out in, I believe it was July of 1948. So that's just before the freeze. And I have only actually found one review of that book, which was published. It's in the November issue of a journal, of a Soviet journal. And so it must have been written, in October, probably went to the presses in October, just a couple of weeks before the freeze actually took effect. But the truth is that the governmental movement against Jewish cultural expression had actually been signaled for quite a few months, because there had been this incident where Golda Meir came to Moscow, and Jews were much more interested in Golda Meir than they were in Stalin. So that there had actually been a signal for quite some months that they were going to try to further assimilate the Jews and try to prevent places where there could be expressions of Jewish culture that might make Jews feel different or special or unlike other Soviet citizens. So the only review of hers that I have found was a largely negative review. I'm good, thank you. was a largely negative review. And I try to figure out sort of what was meant by that. Did they actually not like the work, or were they trying to anticipate the censor's ideas about what was or was not acceptable, published expression of Jewishness? As we know, in the Soviet system, this was often, very much changing ground. So you'd be, one week it would be fine to publish these stories, and the next week it might not be. So it may be that they were just trying to hedge their bets against this being seen as somehow unacceptable. I do find, when looking through this era of Soviet literary journals, that we see a lot of stuff sucking up to Stalin specifically. So I think in that same November issue, I think there's some stuff about how the Jews are going to celebrate Comrade Stalin's birthday in December, that kind of thing. So it's never really possible to know why something like this happens, but at any rate, that is the one review, and it was largely negative. As a result, of course, of the freeze, most of the copies of the book were never distributed. It is exceptionally hard to get a hold of. I do have a copy of it, but it took me years and years of collecting Gorshman's work to find a copy of that book. So when the thaw finally came in 1961, one of the things that that happens when things have been frozen like that for such a period of time is that it takes a while to ramp up afterwards. So there weren't a lot of publishing opportunities within the Soviet Union, even once it was once more allowed. The journals just hadn't, they didn't have the capacity. So at that time, it was considered acceptable to publish in Poland. It was not considered to be, samizdat or anything like that. It was considered to be perfectly fine to publish in Poland, and those books would be distributed in the Soviet Union. So Gorshman did that. A lot of writers did that once the thaw came. It was also a good way to circumvent some of the central figures in Soviet Yiddish publishing, who often were gatekeepers for different reasons. So publishing in Poland was a great opportunity. Poland never had a freeze the way the Soviet Union did, and we do tend to conflate, I think, the different parts of the communist bloc together, but there was a lot of variation, and Poland always had a robust Yiddish cultural presence. Now, both of those first two books, the Der Koech von Leben and 33 Novellen, they're both relatively small books. They're about 150 pages each. But what she started doing at that point was pulling together all the material that had sort of been waiting. And so her third book that came out in 1974 is absolutely a monster. It has 67 stories plus an autobiographical novella. It's over 450 pages, and it could have been much longer, but they used very tiny type and very small margins because they did have paper limitations. So they crushed as much into there as they could. It's an absolutely huge book. And that's pretty much, I think, pretty much everything she wrote up until that time, aside from a few stories that could not be published at that time. So stories that were set in Palestine generally did not get published in that era. But almost everything else she had written up to that time is included in that one book. And then she had a couple more books published in the Soviet Union while she was still there. And then, as you can see, after after her move in 1990 to Israel, then she started republishing books or republishing material in collections. And this book from 1995 called Hannes Schof und Rinder, this book is an expansion of the autobiographical novella that had been published previously in the Soviet Union. It got published as a full-length book in Israel with a lot of material added, and some things that hadn't been acceptable at the time. Her final book, In die Sporen für Geduld Ha'avoda, 1998. Yes, that means she was 92 at the time. It is a very, very tiny book. It's maybe about 30 pages, and it's these sort of disjointed memoirs about her time in Geduld Ha'avoda. So that's also a really interesting book. I mean, all together, it's just a very small book altogether. It would make an interesting translation project if anyone's looking for one. But it is, it's interesting to me that she returned there after the passage of so much time. She returned back. Pardon me. To talk about Gedud. If there aren't any questions at this point, I'd like to share some pictures. Nope. No. That is not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to share a picture. There we go. So I apologize for the quality of some of these pictures. It is rather difficult to find pictures of Gorshman. And so this is from one of the books, one of her books that was published in Israel. This is from when she was in Gedud. She's holding up a lamb. And she was very knowledgeable about animals because of having grown up as she did. This is the earliest picture I've seen of her. She would have been in her early 20s, or maybe about 20 when this picture was taken. And sorry, I have to share them one at a time. I wanted to show you a picture. This is not working very well. I don't know why. It's not letting me move through these pictures. I'm sorry. I'm going to try a different way. Now, I don't think there's anybody here who was grew up in Russia or the Soviet Union. But what we have here is a picture of, oh, is it sharing? Are you seeing that?
No, not in the moment.
Oh, okay. Let me try again. Okay, so what we're seeing here is a picture of from probably, I'm guessing, the 1970s. So here's a picture of Shira Gorshman in the middle. Over here is her daughter Ruth, and over here is her daughter Shulamith. This fellow is named Inokenti Smoktunovsky. Inokenti Smoktunovsky was the single most important film actor in the Soviet Union. They refer to him as the Soviet Laurence Olivier. He was married to Gorshman's daughter, Shulamith. And this is their daughter, Maria Smoktunovskaya. She is alive. I've been in contact with her, unfortunately, since the war in Ukraine. It's very hard to get through, and my Russian translator has tried a number of times, but she is still alive, and she still, she has quite fond memories of her grandmother, and I am hoping at some point to do an interview with her and her uncle, who is the Gorshman's son, who was much younger than his sister, so he is also still alive. So that is a super interesting family connection, and in the book there is a story which is clearly based on the character of Inokenti Smoktunovsky. Okay, so I'd like to talk a little bit about my road back to recovering Gorshman. Um, and I just thought, I've just got these questions here. What does it mean to rediscover forgotten writers? What is our responsibility to them? And what is specific to feminist reclamation? And I just thought I could leave those there and you could um, think about that while I'm talking about, my own journey and how this has panned out for me. Um, so I first encountered Gorshman in the year 2001 in a Yiddish class. She had just died, and so my instructor, Herschel Glesser at YIVO, he brought in her obituary and a story by her, which is called Baba Malka. It's a story in which a midwife finds herself at a crossroads as someone who has always brought life into the world. She has to she finds herself in a situation in which she has to decide if she is justified in taking a life out of the world. So to return to Jess's question about violence, this is a story which really interrogates justifiable violence. So a few years after I had read that story, I actually suggested that my friend Jennifer Kronovit translate it for an anthology called Beautiful as the Moon, Radiant as the Stars. I already had a story that was lined up for that anthology. I didn't have the ability to translate anymore, but I thought it would be a really good addition to that book. And so Jenny translated it, and that's where it's been published. And I belong to a feminist Yiddish reading group. I still belong to them via Zoom now, but at the time I was living in New York, and we studied Gorshman for about a year. I think it was the year 2004. We spent about a year working with different Gorshman texts. And so in 2014, when my very long Celia Dropkin project concluded, I decided to move on to Gorshman. And I chose her because I had never read this kind of material before. I had never sort of come across this kind of voice in Yiddish. It seemed like it was harsher. It was sort of abrasive. It wasn't careful the way a lot of other writers were. And also the centrality of women's situation in these stories impressed me a lot. And I don't know if she had influences from Russian literature, but I'm not aware of somebody else in Yiddish who writes in this way about women. So in addition to working on translations of these stories, I spent a lot of time learning about her and uncovering material about her. There doesn't seem to be there doesn't seem to be any paper archives of her own, of herself. And I found very few reviews of her work in total. The only thing that was very lucky is that she'd been interviewed a number of times, several times on video and one time on audio tape. And I was very lucky that those interviewers chose to share that material with me. So I'm very grateful to the prior researchers who did help me by giving me their materials to work with. There are some autobiographical stories. Of course, there is always a problem with autobiographical stories, and we know which ones are autobiographical because she had an alter ego named Chana. So when a character is named Chana, that is a stand-in for Gorshman. But there's always a problem with autobiographical fiction because it is still fiction, and we can never really know which parts hew closely to reality and which do not. So using her stories autobiographically has been more challenging. Um, if there were other sources that I could compare to, it would be easier. But because there aren't that many sources about her life, it's hard to know which of those stories are based in reality. I will say that I don't think Gorshman has ever been completely forgotten. So when I started my work of recovery and trying to locate, um, you know, a way for Gorshman to speak to us today, it's not like there was no work done. Work had been done on her, and there was some interest in her work specifically among Russian speakers. So, people who speak both Russian and Jewish saw a lot of stuff in her work that spoke to them. But in the West, it's been very hard for Soviet writers to be noticed, to be taken into consideration when we talk about Yiddish literature. That's often sort of a gray zone where we don't really acknowledge what was happening in the Soviet Union. So we talk about literary movements, we leave out the Soviet Union, and so on. Even when I was learning Yiddish, and that was almost 30 years ago when I started learning Yiddish, I don't even think David Bergelson, somebody like a very major, towering figure like that, there was not very much work done even on somebody like him. So for women writers who were very much sidelined within the Soviet system, maybe even more so than in North America, they're in this double disadvantage because they're Soviet and they're women, and it's very hard for them to capture anybody's attention. So when the feminist reclamation of Yiddish women writers started, they did specifically try to include Soviet women, and Gorshman is included in, for example, in the anthology Found Treasures, which came out in the early 1990s, and she is represented in there with a story. So it's just that there are these, there are these sort of little efforts to sort of push her forward, but nothing sort of took hold in a big way. So that's the work that I've been doing, and I've come to understand that a lot of critics understood her in a folkloric way, that they saw that she includes this material about women's traditional knowledge, about things like plant knowledge, traditional medicines, food, cooking, childbirth, maternity. And so they see these topics and they start to understand her as somebody who is a folk writer. She is simply writing what she knows. This is simply, the knowledge that she has. But when I look at her work, what I see is a writer who uses folk wisdom as a part of a creative process. That she is a literary writer making use of these of this kind of these kinds of ideas and this kind of knowledge. And I think in part it's like the way that a lot of writers writers who speak specific dialects, for instance, will often include words or phraseology that is specific to their dialect in the way of making sure that the dialect stays alive. And I feel like she did the same thing with women's knowledge, that she uses women's knowledge in her stories as a way of ensuring that it stays alive. But she also uses it as part of her sort of literary arsenal, where she creates these worlds that center women and women's knowledge. I am told that Gorshman herself was a kind of a master storyteller, and that she often, storytelling was often her primary means of expressing herself creatively, and that her written work was actually kind of the secondary form, and that and so the person who told me this was Gennady Estreich, who's a literary historian of Soviet Yiddish. And so he would hear the stories, and then sometime later, they would show up as written stories. And so it's interesting to me that for her, the oral storytelling comes first. And so if we return to that story that that snippet from her that I read earlier, her description of Leib Kvitko discovering her as a writer, what do we see in that story? We see her positioning herself on her knees, scrubbing the kitchen floor in one of the kommunalki, one of the large shared houses that people did in the large cities in the Soviet system. She is on her knees scrubbing the floors. That is the place of women. And it is women who do that work. I don't believe a male person ever had to take a turn scrubbing a floor in the communal kitchen. It would have been the women who lived in that building who took turns doing that. But on the other hand, writing is men's work, and it is a man who discovers her work and who sort of lifts her up to his level. So I see this as a good example of what Gennady shared with me about the verbal storytelling, that she incorporates information about women's place in society, even when she doesn't bring, that's not the point of the story. And so she enhances the surface level meaning of the story with just this deep underground of, rich description of women's lives. I have been working towards understanding Gorshman as a literary figure for many years now, 10 years, and I'm hoping that my book of translations is going to add to that understanding. I put her story, Der Mitesser, the parasite, first in the collection, and that was for a number of reasons, including the fact that she herself considered it to be her important first work. But also I think it sort of encapsulates her ethos as a storyteller. But a lot of readers have told me that they found it so difficult, they actually have to stop for a few days before they return to the book to read the rest of it, which is interesting. Not every story is as difficult to read as that one. So I don't know. Was that a great idea, editorially speaking? I don't know, but it seemed to me that allowed her to be true to herself by foregrounding that story. My favorite story in the collection is the one called Roommates. And the reason why I love it and why I appreciate it so much is because it is through that story that I understood famine as a gendered experience. And this is something that had never occurred to me before. So I feel like when I learned something like that from a story, that really, that was really sort of a surprise to me. I have a degree in women's studies, and that had never occurred to me. So her insights, when they can surprise me like that, I find them, that's the most exciting part of it for me. I don't want to say I'm the only person who has ever championed Gorshman. I am not, but I do want to share with you a victory. This stupid thing, it doesn't go forward. There we go. A victory. So I want to share with you a couple of sentences from that 1948 review and a couple of sentences from the review of the Book of Translations. So I'll just read this out because they're kind of long. In 1948, the reviewer says, "The writer does not reveal to us any processes nor any personalities which are not already found in our literature. We also do not find here any new viewpoint on a well-known experience or a vision that can reflect the consciousness of today's situation." So that was 1948. And then in 2024, the stories are dense, the characters stoic and uncompromising, and the point of view often purposefully distant. We rarely learn much about the motivations behind the actions we witness, and are given only the slightest glimpse into the unfolding dreams and thoughts of the characters. Yet this collection is arresting, even transformative. These stories are a poetic and powerful representation of the incredible complexity of life in the face of tragedy, suffering, and uncertainty. So that made me feel pretty damn good about doing this work. Before I just we get into our open conversation, which I hope we'll just all unmute ourselves and just chat. I just want to share some resources, which we can email out as well. So these are the 3 books where you can read stories about Gorshman or by Gorshman. One is my collection, and then the other 2 are older. I have included the Amazon links because actually, such is the state of book distribution at the moment. This is the only place to get these books. I think Beautiful is the Moon and Found Treasures are both at the Vancouver Public Library. If somebody would like to suggest that the Vancouver Public Library should get Meant to Be and other stories, that could help. Just feel free to do that. So those are the places where you can read her stories. And then I also wanted to send you some links. So the first 2 are videos done with Gorshman. The second one is in Russian. The first one is in Yiddish with English subtitles, which I worked on. My feminist reading group did the subtitles for the Gorshman video for Boris Sandler, who was the interviewer. And then I wanted to give you a link to my essay about why women writers get forgotten, and then an amazing book which explains so many things about Yiddish culture by the wonderful late David Schneer. So that is me talking. So now I would just love it if we could just have sort of more of a free conversation about anything that you would be interested in talking about Shira Gorshman, or about women writers, or about Yiddish in the Soviet Union, or any of those things that I've just been talking about. Thank you.
Can I ask something,
so
Faith?
Of course.
Wait, I'm just gonna stop recording so people can join the talk.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Faith, for an amazing talk, and I'm excited to hear the Q&As. Thank you.